The global energy heartland just hit a flat line, and the shockwaves are tearing through trading floors from New York to Singapore. Brent crude has exploded by 13%, catapulting to $82 per barrel in a single session. That is a staggering $930 jump in contract value since Friday's closing bell. West Texas Intermediate followed the same violent trajectory, spiking 12% to $75.33. Investors are not just worried. They are sprinting towards safety, pushing gold and silver into a vertical climb while the Strait of Hormuz becomes a ghost town for commercial shipping. The catalyst for this chaos is the effective closure of the world's most critical maritime choke point. Through this narrow strip of water, 20% of the world's daily oil supply, over 14 million barrels, usually flows to keep global industry alive. But today, the taps are effectively dry. This is not just a military blockade. It is a financial exodus. Insurance companies have withdrawn coverage overnight, and tanker operators have suspended all operations, rendering the passage a no-go zone. What makes this catastrophe unique, and frankly quite bitter, is its origin. We are not looking at an act of external aggression or an unpredictable natural disaster, but a calculated, albeit reckless, American war of choice. As the administration launches a regime change conflict in Iran, the global economy is being handed the bill for a war that even the Pentagon's own briefers suggested was unnecessary. We are witnessing the opening act of a self-inflicted economic meltdown that threatens to erase years of carefully managed stability since the Russia-Ukraine crisis. In this video, we will dissect the mechanics of this unfolding stagflation, expose the staggering gap between political promises and economic reality, and reveal why the 1970s might soon look like the good old days. The mechanics of this disaster are as predictable as they are devastating. We have entered the dreaded stagflation maze, a toxic cocktail of soaring prices and stagnant growth that economists have been dreading since the disco era. Analysts from Barclays and UBS are already screaming into their microphones, warning that oil markets are facing their worst fears, with prices potentially screaming past $120 per barrel. Let us look at the cold, hard math of a supply shock. For every $10 increase in the price of crude oil, approximately 0.4% is shaved off the national gross domestic product, while simultaneously adding 0.4% to the inflation rate. If oil maintains its current trajectory toward $130 per barrel, we are looking at a massive inflation hit of between 1.6 and 2.4%. That is not just a rounding error. It is a full-scale recessionary drag. The Federal Reserve is now officially trapped in a cage of its own making. Usually, when inflation spikes, the Fed raises interest rates to cool things down. But with unemployment already climbing to 4.5% and consumer spending slowing to a crawl, raising rates would be like throwing a drowning man an anchor. Conversely, if they cut rates to stimulate growth, they simply pour high-octane fuel onto the inflationary fire. This is policy paralysis in its purest form. The International Energy Agency and the International Monetary Fund are looking at these numbers with growing horror. The bottom half of the economy was already effectively in a recession before the first missile was even fueled. Now, with a cost-push inflation nightmare triggered by a war of choice, the American consumer is being squeezed from both ends. As economist Peter Schiff pointed out, these problems were strengthening long before the conflict began. The war just provided a convenient, albeit expensive, excuse for a systemic failure that was already in motion. The political irony here is so thick you could almost refine it into fuel, which is fortunate, because the actual fuel is becoming a luxury item. On the campaign trail, the promise was simple: $50 oil and the kind of cheap gasoline that makes a V8 engine feel like a sensible life choice. Instead, the administration is delivering a masterclass in the exact opposite. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed, gasoline prices that recently averaged $2.98 per gallon are now on a vertical climb toward $5. For the American voter, this is not just an abstract economic data point, it is a direct raid on their bank accounts. And the timing? It is nothing short of catastrophic for the incumbent party. Midterm elections are exactly 10 months away, and nothing motivates a voter quite like the silent, creeping rage of watching the numbers on a gas pump spin like a slot machine. The political base that was promised an end to the era of forever wars is now watching a regime change operation in a country nearly 4 times the size of Iraq, with more than twice the population. The narrative being spun by the White House is that this stagflation is simply the necessary cost of freedom. It is a classic move: wrap economic failure in a flag and hope no one looks at the receipts. However, the cracks in the story are already visible. Pentagon briefers have already admitted to Congress that there was no intelligence suggesting an imminent Iranian attack. This was not a defensive move. It was a war of choice that is now systematically dismantling the economic promises that propelled this administration to power. Trump ran on the idea of bringing down inflation and avoiding costly foreign entanglements. Yet he is currently prosecuting a conflict that ensures the exact crisis he swore to prevent. The very voters who wanted to put America first are now finding themselves last in line to pay for a war they never asked for. While Washington remains fixated on its war of choice, the rest of the world is frantically recalculating its survival. The geopolitical chessboard has shifted, and the United States is finding itself increasingly isolated in a storm of its own making. In Asia, the panic is palpable. Governments in Beijing, New Delhi, and Seoul are staring at a logistical nightmare. As 3/4 of the 14 million barrels that normally pass through the Strait of Hormuz are destined for their ports, Asian refineries are currently scrambling to assess stockpiles, but the reality is stark. There is no magic switch to replace 1/3 of the world's seaborne crude exports. Contrast this with the calculated pivot of the European Union. Having survived the energy trauma of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, European allies have spent the last few years diversifying their energy portfolios with the intensity of a prepper. They have invested heavily in strategic petroleum reserves and cut their dependency on single maritime choke points. While higher oil prices will still sting the Eurozone, the German Marshall Fund notes that the impact is distributed far differently this time. Europe is no longer the captive audience it once was. In fact, Denmark has gone as far as listing the United States alongside Russia and China as a potential threat to election interference, a move that signals a profound collapse in transatlantic trust. The global perception of American leadership is undergoing a radical and perhaps permanent reassessment. European and Asian allies are watching Washington launch a conflict based on questionable intelligence, triggering a global economic contagion that threatens their own domestic stability. Even the traditional safety valves are failing. While Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have some spare capacity, it is a drop in the bucket. They simply lack the pipeline infrastructure to bypass the Strait of Hormuz and offset a 10 million barrel per day deficit. The era of relying on a single superpower to guarantee global trade stability is being replaced by a cynical, fractured reality where every nation is out for itself. The final reckoning for 2026 is no longer a distant warning. It is a visible collapse. As the United States essentially implodes economically, we are seeing a mass exodus of capital that is as swift as it is terrifying. Investors have stopped listening to the official narratives and started looking at the price of gold and silver, both of which are hitting record highs as the world hedges against a dying dollar. This is a classic currency debasement play. A weak dollar means every single import, from microchips to mangoes, now costs more, creating a cost-push inflation nightmare that sits heavy on top of the existing oil shock. The numbers coming out of the oil markets are particularly grim. While OPEC Plus announced a production increase of 206,000 barrels per day starting in April, that is quite literally a drop in the bucket. When you are facing a potential loss of 8 to 10 million barrels per day due to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a few 100,000 extra barrels is like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. The wealth effect that has supported American consumption for years is evaporating as investment portfolios tank and consumer confidence hits the floor. Businesses have stopped investing, not because they lack capital, but because the uncertainty has become a paralyzing fog. This is the worst-case scenario that every serious economist warned about. We are witnessing a replay of the 1970s OPEC crisis, but with a much darker twist. This one was entirely self-inflicted. It is a crisis manufactured in Washington, sustained by a war that even the military admits was not necessary, and paid for by a public that was promised peace and prosperity. The American economy is being sacrificed on the altar of strategic recklessness. But that is just my analysis of the data. Now, I want to hear from you. Are we looking at the inevitable cost of global leadership? Or is this simply the highest price ever paid for a strategic blunder? Do you think the American consumer can survive $5 gas? Or is the breaking point already behind us? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read as many as I can. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.